If you walked into a London tavern in 1860, you wouldn't just find dock workers drowning their sorrows. You'd find mothers, and in their arms, infants were being fed from a communal mug of thick, dark, frothy ale. This wasn't a lapse in judgment, it was a survival strategy. In the shadows of the Victorian Empire, the most dangerous thing you could give a child wasn't a sharp object, it was a glass of white, pure milk. To the working class, beer was liquid bread, a filtered, fermented shield against a city trying to kill them from the inside out. But as you're about to see, the safety of the pub was just another trap in a city where every meal was a gamble with the grave. The white poison, the milk scandal. To understand why a parent would give a toddler a pint of stout, you have to look at the pure milk being sold on the streets. In 1850s London, milk didn't come from a refrigerated farm. It came from cow houses hidden in the city's dampest cellars.
These cows lived their entire lives in darkness, standing knee-deep in their own filth, fed on distillery swill, the fermented leftovers of gin production. This diet made the cows perpetually drunk, and their milk a watery bluish tint. But the Victorian milkman was a master of chemistry, and not the good kind. To hide the blue color and make the milk look rich, they added a cocktail of horrors: chalk and plaster of Paris to give it body and whiteness, starch to make it thicker, sheep's brains. Yes, you read that right. Ground up brains were occasionally whisked into the vats to create a creamy head on top of the milk, borax to mask the smell of the milk as it began to rot in the summer heat. When a mother saw her child thinning away, she assumed the blue milk was the cause. Beer, by comparison, was boiled during the brewing process, killing the bacteria that the medical experts didn't even know existed yet. It had calories, it had vitamins.
And, most importantly, it didn't contain ground sheep brains. It was a rational choice in an irrational world. The sooty lungs of the empire. While the babies were being quieted with ale, the air they breathed was doing its own work. We've all seen the romantic London fog in movies, but the reality was a yellow soup so thick you could taste it. It wasn't just moisture, it was the concentrated exhaust of millions of coal fires and industrial chimneys.
This fog was a chemical weapon. In the Great Smog events of the mid-19th century, the mortality rate didn't just rise, it spiked. People weren't just coughing, their lungs were literally being tattooed from the inside with carbon. If a doctor performed an autopsy on a Londoner in 1880, they didn't find pink lung tissue, they found a black, leathery mass. The city's solution? More invigorating tonics. This leads us back to the medicine cabinet. If the beer didn't put the baby to sleep and the soot made them cough, the Victorian mother reached for Godfrey's cordial, also known as mother's friend. It was a sweet syrup made of treacle, water, and the star ingredient, opium. It was incredibly effective. A few drops and the child stopped crying. They stopped coughing. Sometimes they simply stopped breathing. The quietness of a Victorian nursery was often the silence of a slow-motion overdose. It's estimated that in some industrial districts, nearly 50% of infants died before the age of 5. They weren't just dying of fever, they were being sedated, poisoned, and starved by the very products marketed to save them. The architecture of death, the night soil men. Now, you might wonder, if the milk was toxic and the air was black, why didn't they just wash everything? Because in 1850, water was the enemy. Most Londoners got their water from communal pumps. These pumps were often located just a few feet away from cesspools, underground pits where every resident of a tenement dropped their waste. London didn't have a modern sewer system yet. It had night soil men. These were laborers who worked in the dead of night, descending into these pits to shovel out human waste by hand. They would carry it in buckets through the hallways of the houses, dripping onto the floorboards where children played, and load it into carts to be sold as fertilizer. The problem? The pits leaked. The liquid from the cesspools seeped through the porous brickwork directly into the groundwater. When you pumped a glass of clear water, you were often drinking a diluted tea of your neighbor's cholera. This is why the beer was king.
The fermentation process was the only thing standing between a Londoner and an agonizing death from dehydration and infection. The Great Stink and the Death of the Thames. By 1858, the situation reached a breaking point known as the Great Stink. The River Thames, which received all the overflow from these cesspools, became a literal river of sludge. The smell was so overpowering that Parliament had to soak their turtons in chloride of lime just to be able to sit in the building. They thought the smell was what killed people. They called it miasma. They believed that if you could just mask the odor with perfume or aromatic vinegars, you would be safe. They were literally standing on the edge of a biological volcano, spraying perfume at it. This lack of understanding created a cycle of curiosity and horror. People would go to the banks of the Thames just to see the bubbles of gas rising from the rot, large enough, some claimed, to be set on fire. It was a morbid tourist attraction for a city that was effectively drowning in its own progress. The living dead in the parlor. If you survived the milk, the soot, the opium, and the water, you still had to deal with the social pressure of the Victorian good death. Because death was so frequent, it became a performance. We talked about the post-mortem photos, but the rituals went deeper. When a person died in a Victorian house, the clocks were stopped at the moment of death.
Mirrors were covered with black cloth, supposedly to prevent the spirit from being trapped, but also to stop the living from seeing their own haggard, terrified reflections. The mourning wasn't just a feeling, it was an industry. You had to wear specific shades of black for specific months. If you failed to mourn correctly, you were socially ostracized. This meant that even in the middle of a financial crisis caused by the death of a breadwinner, a widow was expected to spend her last pennies on crepe fabric and jet jewelry. The dead were a heavy burden on the living, both emotionally and financially. The final puncture of the myth. History likes to remember the Victorian era as a time of grand balls and colonial pride, but look closer at the portraits of those dashing gentlemen and elegant ladies. Notice the heavy makeup. It wasn't just for beauty, it was to hide the pockmarks from smallpox or the pale, ghostly skin of the White Plague, tuberculosis. The lead-based powders they used to achieve that noble paleness were slowly shutting down their organs. The green wallpaper in their nurseries, dyed with Shields green, contained arsenic that flaked off into the air as they slept. Victorian London was a trap. Every innovation seemed to carry a hidden sting. The liquid bread that saved the baby from cholera gave them a lifelong dependency. The pure bread that fed the worker contained the bones of the dead. The very fabric of their homes was toxic. It wasn't a golden age, it was a desperate 100-year-long struggle to survive the consequences of a world that was moving faster than its own understanding. They weren't refined, they were survivors. And the next time you see a charming Victorian antique, you might want to ask yourself, what's still lingering on its surface?